I love procedural things about all of this. Claire, I'll get to you about something in a second, but I once again want to talk about Senator Leyonhjelm. We debated this a bit last night, but the suggestion being that there'd been some sort of a deal or a side conversation with your good self about the ABCC legislation was that there would be a free vote of Liberal MPs about the Territory's right to be able to make laws and not have those laws overruled by a federal government. Now, specifically, it ends up being about euthanasia, but it's about that general principle about whether or not a self-governing area is able to be overruled by another place. It doesn't happen for a state. Why should it happen for a territory? And Michael Gunner, the Chief Minister of the NT, was asked about this today.
I absolutely support the return of those laws to the territory, the return of that power to Territorians. I think it would be an extremely significant moment for the territory, especially as it comes to the 40th anniversary of being a territory. We have seen an erosion of territory rights since that self-government was first conferred 40 years ago. I believe this would be a powerful moment in returning that power back to Territorians.
Must say I was distracted by that awesome John Farnham poster that was behind him. He'll be in Townsville, of course, for the supercars. We're all very excited. I bleed bogan. I will never pretend otherwise. But Senator Leyonhjelm, is it about euthanasia specifically, or is it about the overall quirk of the territory being able to be overruled by the federal government?
Yeah, it's not really a quirk. The territories are subject to Commonwealth legislation or overrule, and that occurred in 1997 with what's commonly known as the Andrews Bill, when Kevin Andrews, who's still in the House, moved a private member's bill in response to the fact that the Northern Territory had legislated to allow assisted suicide. He disagreed with that, of course. He's a Conservative. And he said he didn't want that to occur. He introduced a private member's bill into the House. It was voted on in a conscience vote, or free vote or whatever. Then it went to the Senate, again voted in a conscience vote, and it became law. So what my bill is intended to do, if it passes, is basically undo that so that the Northern Territory and the ACT can then legislate on assisted suicide if they want to. If they don't want to, well, that's up to them. But the idea is to put them on the same footing as the states. We're seeing the states, one by one, have these debates about assisted suicide. So far, only Victoria has approved it, and then only very restricted circumstances. But it's a debate that needs to occur, and it shouldn't be overridden in the territories by the Commonwealth. So that's the point of it. So when the vote occurs, though, there will be some people who will be voting for territory rights, and then there will be others who will be voting because they want to see assisted suicide coming in. Now, I don't mind what reason they use. If they vote for my bill, that's fine with me. I'll take any vote's a good vote.
David, the important thing to remember about the Northern Territory is that the 1978 legislation that gave them self-government specifically left in that legislation the right of the Commonwealth to overrule territory legislation, largely because of all the money that the Commonwealth puts into the territory. But the second point is the Northern Territory had the opportunity to vote for statehood. It was given that opportunity and it voted no. So please don't come this bleating cause about the Northern Territory being able to govern itself in all ways when it had the opportunity and said no thanks. So when it comes to the other question, I voted for the Andrews Bill. I will always vote against authorising by law the right of one human being to put another one to death. I will always oppose that, and that's what euthanasia is. Right. It was invented by Hitler, where he disposed of people who were considered useless to his National Socialist Party aims, and he killed something like 200,000 people who met that criteria. There is nothing edifying about euthanasia, not all the metaphors in the world. It is, at the end of the day, authorising one person to put another human being to death. If you want to take your own life, that's a matter for you.
Your views are totally out of step. Your views are totally out of step with Australians, they are, and it's particularly out of step with people your age. As people get older and they start to think about their own mortality, they realise that, well, look, it may get to the point where I think it's time to go, and I won't be able to do it anymore. There's no law against taking your own life so long as you're still able to do it. But once you become too old, too sick, too feeble, and you need somebody to go, even though you would dearly love to go, it's against the law for anyone to help you.
David,
That's
Professor
what this
Peter
law is
Singer,
about.
AC, thinks it's fine to put disabled children to death at birth.
Okay. My thing is look, we can have
different subject.
We can have part two of the conversation, which is the euthanasia bit, but just the part one part about the federal government or federal parliament being able to overrule the territory. And we'll get back to euthanasia in a second. But Claire, as somebody who's worked in government, seen how it's worked in the Northern Territory, yes, there was that vote, and it was 51-49 against a move towards statehood. How do you feel about the bill that Senator Leyonhjelm is discussing?
Well, I think it's more than just euthanasia. I think it's a much bigger issue, and I think it's about pushing back on the failed state narrative that federal governments in the past have sort of grabbed at lazily to trot out to explain what the idiosyncrasies of the Northern Territory are, which mostly have to do with the massive tyranny of distance and isolated population. And an Indigenous community, and I'll just make a few points here. So if you look at the territory as a whole, it has at times the fastest growing economy globally. It punches well above its weight. It's been able to attract significant investment from Asia. Indeed, the Ichthys Impex project up there was the single biggest investment that a Japanese company made outside of Japanese soil. It has a significant brains trust around tropical health. Its vaccinations rates are higher than anywhere else in the country. It's one of the only jurisdictions to close the gap on infant mortality, and its government administration and structures are pretty sophisticated. They've introduced an anti-corruption body. They've got 50% women in cabinet. I could go on. Kids in territory schools learn Indonesian. And all of this is very different to the message that's painted in Canberra, who want Australians and the commentariat and all of the influencers to think of the Northern Territory as a failed state, which it's not. And it's successfully...
I think it's failed on child protection.
Look, there is no doubt that there are significant challenges that we're having, not just in the territory, but in Indigenous communities across Australia. But I don't think that they've failed on the challenge to have a response to child protection. I think they've gone more than 50% of the way on what they need to do, including, and we've talked about this at length in your show, so I won't go into too much detail, but the most progressive response to child protection that Australians ever seen. And I think it's just time up on the federal government just sort of lazily trotting out this failed state narrative.
It's
we're hearing
failed state, it's mendicant state.
And we're enough of sort of the politicians that frankly don't come to the Northern Territory, and bureaucrats that don't visit, and no more ANU graduates that's think in their do-gooderism they'll head up to the Northern Territory, you know, to rewrite their social policy agenda. I think, you know, increasingly we're looking at what's happening up north, and I think credit where credit's due.
All right, Senator Hume, how would you vote if this was to come to the floor?
Well, this is going to be an interesting one, I think, for a lot of people on my side of the chamber, mainly because I think probably the majority aren't comfortable with the euthanasia debate at all. You know, they're not comfortable with assisted dying, and speaking for myself, I'm not comfortable with assisted dying yet, and David and I have had that discussion just this week. But at the same time, most of us are staunch federalists as opposed to centrists too, and that's where the interesting, you know, dichotomy is going to take place, I think.
Sorry, Bronwyn, just one more for Senator Leyonhjelm. What is the understanding you have from the Prime Minister? Because either people were putting words in your mouth or he's being verbal. What is your understanding of either an arrangement or a pledge that you have with the Prime Minister?
Oh, this goes back over 18 months in the context of the negotiations over the ABCC legislation, which, as you know, was a key issue for the double dissolution election. I had some problems with that bill because it contained quite a lot of coercive elements, reverse onus of proof and removal of the right to silence, for example. I hate voting for those sorts of things, but if I'd insisted on removal of those, I thought there was a pretty good chance I'd gut the bill, and I supported the intention of the bill. So I went looking for liberty offsets. You know, if you're a miner and you're going to dig up an area of ground for a mine of some description, there's this concept called environmental offsets, where you go and get an equal area of ground and you protect it. I figured liberty offsets was a reasonable sort of analogy, so I went looking for increases in liberty to offset the losses in the ABCC. One of them was a subject dear to my heart and the Liberal Democrats' heart, which is assisted suicide. Now, it's not Commonwealth jurisdiction. So the deal was I would support the ABCC, and in exchange there are a number of liberty offsets, but the one that's now public is the Prime Minister would allow a conscience vote in the Senate on my bill, on my Territory Rights Bill, and if it passes the Senate, he would also allow it to be debated and voted on a conscience vote basis in the House. Now, it doesn't bind the Prime Minister or the government to anything other than allowing the vote to occur. That's it.
Now, Bronwyn, obviously the makeup of the Liberal caucus has changed a lot since 1996. One would argue, as an observer, Jane, probably as the insider to the party, may disagree, but it feels like it's lurched a little more to the left, a little more, and the moderate faction seem to be in charge a lot more. That's a lot different than what it was. The left faction. A lot different than what it was in 1996. So what do you think the Liberal Party would end up actually doing if they were given the free hand here? And as Jane has correctly said, a good egg that we want to stay in the Senate, everyone, please. About the classic fight that's inside a Liberal about what to do here.
You might be surprised to know, but there are plenty of people on the Labor side who voted against it too. So it's not simply a matter for the Liberal Party, it's a matter for individuals in the Senate. And as I said, your life is your own. What you do with your life is your business. But to actually legislate, which doctors do not want, because if you go back to when Hitler invented euthanasia, it was doctors who carried it out, and doctors do not want a bar of it.
But aren't we in a scenario
So to legislate to say one human being can put another human being to death is just, to me, an anathema.
But it's this thing where...
And on the question of being out of kilter, I intend to be around at least as long as the Queen, so don't fuss about that. But secondly, the question of I don't approve of capital punishment for criminals either. So that puts me out of lockstep probably with a lot of people's thinking out there in the community as well. Right. But it is a very strongly held principle on my part.
But also it's this thing, Senator Hume, where the question of euthanasia is a very different one than it was in 1996, because the Victorian Parliament has gone through a process of a codified system that will slowly be brought into implementation. So we are going to see how this works and how this doesn't work.
It'll be the death state.
Well, this is the thing. What's your view about how Victoria is either going to lead the way or be the one-off experiment here?
Well, can I tell you that I thought that the debate that we had in Victoria over assisted suicide was actually incredibly divisive. It is a very restrictive piece of legislation that has been passed in Victoria, but at the same time, a lot of the people on my side of the fence still weren't comfortable with it. Even the ones that I thought were, more progressive in their thinkings weren't comfortable with it. There just weren't enough safeguards there. How do you legislate against guilt? This is the hardest part for me. How do we stop, older Australians being guilted into taking their own lives by their children or their, or their relatives or whoever it might be? I think this is the hardest part, of this legislation. Now, if somebody shows me some legislation that can address that, I'm open to the idea, because some of my older party members, you're absolutely right, David, are actually very keen on this. But I'm not there. I'm not there.
But this is the thing where... You go, David.
Well, I'm just thinking in terms of, what harm can be done if assisted suicide is permitted, but I'm thinking about the harm that can be done if assisted suicide is continued to be blocked by the government by force of law. And we have the recent example of David Goodall, scientist, 104 years old, had all his mental marbles, but his body was absolutely failing, and he wanted to go. He absolutely wanted to go.
And he could have done it himself.
There was no... There was no question about his state of mind, and I think that's an important point to make. There was no question about his point of mind. The poor guy had to go to Switzerland in order to avoid a long, slow, painful, lingering death.
No, he didn't.
I
He
think
could
it's
have done it
immoral,
himself, David, here in Australia
absolutely
if he wanted
immoral
to.
of the government to say you can't do that. It's not the government's business. It's his body.
Yeah, I mean, my issue too is, look, I'm further down the line than many watching the program, and I understand that I'm probably out of step with you on this as well, but I am in favour of it for many of the reasons that David has just said. But also I believe that the system in Victoria, I'm fascinated by about the lengths of time, the types of illnesses that you have to have. So, Jane, that to me is where I start to address the guilt factor, where you can't invent a terminal illness created out of guilt. But conversely, the area that I think the Victorian law is weakest in, Claire, is the punishments for some of the people who either may try to push you to a decision, and there's a few issues around those family members where, to me, pardon me, I've got bad smoker's cough this evening, that's my concern there, is that as long as you get a lot of punishments around the system for the people who would try to push people into it, but of course the only people who qualify for it are the people pretty far down the line. We are so over time. I'm sorry, Bronwyn. I'll take a break. If people want to add more, we will. In the meantime, we'll have a quick